We're constantly hearing warnings about our ever-expanding human footprint, right? But today, in this explainer, we're diving into a seriously counterintuitive idea. What if the ultimate cure for overpopulation is actually economic growth? So to figure out where we're headed, we gotta look at where we're at right now. On November 15th, 2022, the UN marked a massive milestone, the day of 8 billion. I mean, having 8 billion people alive on Earth at the same time, that is a staggering reflection of human progress. It really speaks to these massive leaps we've made in public health, huge drops in infant and maternal mortality, and unprecedented levels of poverty eradication that have extended life expectancies literally all over the globe.
But it's not just that total number, it's the sheer speed of this growth. Back in 1960, we hit 3 billion people, and it took 14 years to add the next billion. But look at the compression here as we get closer to the present. The gap between the 7th and 8th billion, that shrank down to just 11 years. Our growth has just been accelerating, compounding on itself incredibly fast over the last half-century.
Which brings us to a pretty provocative question, and really the core of our explainer today. Is our population just going to keep exploding until we totally exhaust every resource on the planet? Or is the cure for overpopulation actually hiding right there in our economy? We're going to examine some incredibly robust, recent modeling that completely challenges the old assumption that unchecked population growth is just inevitable.
All right, Section 1, Wealth and Population Growth, a counterintuitive paradox. Let's get into it.
So the source research puts forward this wild paradox. Making the world richer actually results in fewer people. It sounds totally backwards at first, I know, but it's beautifully explained by what economists call unified growth theory. Basically, as economies industrialize, the labor market expands, and the wages for skilled labor go up. Suddenly, the opportunity cost of having kids increases. Women are incentivized to pursue higher education and formal employment, and so families start choosing to invest way more heavily in the education of fewer children rather than relying on the physical labor of many.
The really crucial point here is figuring out exactly when this shift locks in, and empirical data points to a very specific threshold. Once a country hits a gross domestic product, or GDP, per capita of around $30,000, which by the way is roughly the wealth level of a country like Spain today, fertility rates just stabilize. Actually, they drop below the replacement level of about 2.1 children per woman. Beyond this specific wealth threshold, population growth naturally flatlines, and social norms shift permanently.
Moving on to Section 2, Forecasting Our Future with GDP Scenarios. So researchers took that $30,000 threshold and modeled out different global economic trajectories for the 21st century just to see exactly how wealth would dictate our sheer numbers. And wow, notice the massive divergence in these curves. That black line right there in the middle, that's our business as usual baseline. But those upper and lower curves represent entirely different versions of the world depending strictly on how rich or poor we actually become.
Let's break down what those extremes actually mean for us. In a stagnant world, so zero economic growth after the year 2020, the human population just skyrockets to an overwhelming 15 billion by the year 2100. Literally no peak in sight. But in a booming world where annual GDP growth is 50% higher than our current baseline expectations, the story completely flips. In that high-growth scenario, the global population actually peaks early around 2056 and then drops all the way back down to 7.8 billion by 2100. Think about that. That is essentially the exact same number of people we have on Earth today.
Okay, Section 3, the regional divide and where wealth matters most.
So if wealth truly shrinks the global population, who actually needs this wealth the most to stabilize the numbers? Well, it's not North America or Western Europe. Their populations are already stabilizing or even actively shrinking. Looking at this heat map, the dark blue areas highlight the regions most sensitive to future GDP assumptions, and you can clearly see it right there. Sub-Saharan Africa is absolutely the focal point of our future demographic trajectory.
Let's really look at the sheer scale of Sub-Saharan Africa's impact on these models. By the end of this century, this region alone is projected to make up a third of the entire world's population. Plus, it contains 9 of the top 10 individual countries most sensitive to GDP changes. To put that into perspective, we're talking about a massive 535 million person difference in Sub-Saharan Africa alone, entirely dependent on whether we follow a low or high GDP growth scenario.
So ultimately, the global population bomb doesn't get diffused in places that are already wealthy. The trajectory for the entire world essentially hinges on realizing socio-economic change in rapidly developing regions, primarily sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Getting them to reach that vital demographic transition is everything.
Which brings us to Section 4, the environmental paradox and the trade-offs of wealth.
Because let's be honest, you can't talk about raising global wealth without talking about the climate. We have to weigh two competing realities here. On the one hand, a significantly smaller global population is, theoretically, much better for the environment. There are just fewer people consuming resources. But on the other hand, the higher global wealth required to actually shrink that population naturally drives up per capita greenhouse gas emissions. Because wealthier people, well, they consume more food, more water, and far more energy.
However, there's a critical balancing factor we need to consider. Economic growth and technological innovation go hand in hand. A richer world isn't just a world that consumes more, it's a world with the capital, the education, and the infrastructure to innovate way faster. This economic engine could potentially accelerate the green technologies we absolutely need to offset that increased per capita consumption.
Which leaves us with this final thought for our explainer today. The cure for overpopulation might indeed be aggressive economic growth, but our next great challenge will balancing that newfound wealth with the absolute limits of our planet. So can we innovate fast enough to support a richer but smaller world? It really is a delicate race between the wealth that limits our numbers and the technology that limits our footprint.